Okay, welcome everybody. I'm very happy to see so many of you here today. We have a very special guest, and she's special not only because she has graduated from the top American universities such as Harvard, University of California, Berkeley, and Yale, but also because of what she does and how she does it, which is connecting philosophy, aesthetics, and affect. And this is something which you're about to see and hear. So please welcome Dr. Marta Figlerowicz, who's going to deliver a talk on affect and awareness, James Baldwin.
Thank you for this wonderful introduction. Can everybody hear me in the back? Yes? No?
Closer.
Come closer. Come closer.
Please. We have time. There is no hurry.
Okay? Please come down.
Yeah, you brought this onto yourselves. You shouldn't have told me.
We were sitting here for an hour and so. Look, so many seats over there. Please come down. Okay? Okay. Over there. I want to know.
Okay, we're going to try this again. Can everybody hear me in the back row? Thank you, guys. Hi. So, the talk I'm going to give today comes out of a larger book project, which is coming out in a month and a half. And to give you some context for the reading I'm going to do of James Baldwin in particular, I'm going to begin by spending a little bit of time telling you about the book in general. And this seems especially important because I'm, as Justyna mentioned, I'm not the kind of literary critic who does literary history. I'm more interested in using literature as philosophical examples and as occasions for critical and philosophical thought. And in this project, I'm particularly interested in the question of how a critic's experience as an affectively driven being impacts her subject position as an analyst of affects and as someone who tries to evaluate how broadly resonant or relevant or unusual certain affects are. I look back to the Modernists to help me investigate those questions, and that is in part because this is a time in literary history when those questions about the unconscious first begin to be asked, but don't yet coalesce around ready-made answers. So because of how heavily affect theory often implicitly leans on the principles of psychoanalysis and other originally modernist intellectual creations, looking back at this period can help us see what is at stake in declaring yourself or somebody else to be the arbiter of your feelings, while also declaring those feelings to be partly unconscious, inscrutable, or uncontrollable. So this is all very abstract. And to explain what I mean by this and what kinds of situations I have in mind in the project, I often begin by looking to James Baldwin, and in particular to James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room. So let's have a show of hands. How many of you have actually read Giovanni's Room?
It used to be our obligatory reading in the first year when I was a student here, but not
okay.
anymore.
Well, this is like my performative exercise. Bring it back. But so Giovanni's Room is an unusual novel by Baldwin. Most of his novels are about the conditions of African Americans living in the United States in the 50s and 60s. This particular novel, he got a lot of flack for, actually. It was his second novel. And the main protagonist is a white American who goes to Paris with his fiancée, who's a woman, and then he falls in love with a man named Giovanni. And the rest of the book is him like freaking out about this and trying to figure out if he will actually come out and stay with Giovanni or whether he will go back to America with his fiancée Hella. And so in the first sections of Giovanni's room, David, this American tourist, finds himself talking to Giovanni at a gay bar in Paris. And then, so they're talking for a while, and he's like, oh, what a nice man, maybe we're going to be friends. And then he looks around, and he suddenly realizes, like, oh, everybody here seems to assume that we're flirting. And then he's like, come to think of it, I do think that we are flirting. And it's an interesting situation because he comes to a moment of awareness about something that he recognizes to be part of his own psyche, but he comes to it out of watching other people's responses to it. And he says explicitly, I knew that they were watching, had been watching both of us. They knew that they had witnessed a beginning. So the possibility that somebody else might notice my affect is built into its very definition, especially the notion that somebody might notice it even before I do. That's because unlike, say, feelings or passions, affects are not, by definition, immediately or even necessarily conscious. To demonstrate this delay between having an affect and cognizing it, the theorist Brian Masumi famously invokes scientific test subjects who are strapped into encephalograph machines and timers. And he kind of uses this complicated scientific analysis to show that an intention can form in your brain before you become consciously capable of voicing it. I would contend that experiences like the one Baldwin attributes to David are probably at least as formative as the ones pursued by such scientific experiments to how affects shape our daily phenomenology and our understanding of ourselves. Indeed, what else but such experiences might make you want to conduct empirical trials of cognition in the first place? Because we often do not immediately discern our affects, they lay us open to the people around us. The gap between our affective expression and our awareness of it often makes us vulnerable to our environments, and it casts doubt on whether we are always the best judges of what we bring forth into them. So in the scene that I was just describing to you, the men who surround Giovanni and David neither further nor impede their courtship. They kind of just like look at them and they're like, oh, these guys are flirting, and then like, okay, back to drinking. So even though David is preoccupied and moved, and to him this is an amazing, crazy experience, it's the first time he's articulating to himself that maybe he's gay, but to the people around him, this is a very commonplace event. And this is paradoxical, in part because David's self-discovery does seem to depend quite strictly on this relatively indifferent, quite casually curious group. And in fact, a great part of his shock comes from the way these other people's knowing looks help him articulate something about himself without their even intending or trying to do so. Spaces of Feeling, which is the title of the book in general, examines scenes like this throughout modernist novels and poems, and it does so to illustrate reasons why such dispersed intersubjective access that we have to our affects should figure more prominently in the philosophical and political frameworks that we build around them. Affects have long been described as subverting our sense of ourselves as coherent subjects because of the delayed conscious access we have to them. I stress that they also undercut our pretense of autonomy and even belatedly interpreting our bodily and mental states. Furthermore, affects give rise to a tension between our dependence on others for our self-awareness and these others' relative lack of concern about whether or not we can explicate our feelings to ourselves. Early and mid-20th century Anglophone and French literature stages many episodes like the one I just described, in which an outward environment or another person prompts characters and speakers to recognize a gap between their affective effusions and the introspective awareness they have of these affects. Oh, I'm sorry. I moved away from the camera. These poems and novels depict most of their speakers and characters as strongly wedded to a notion of themselves as capable, if not of fully controlling their minds and bodies, then at least of retroactively observing and interpreting them on their own. The revealed dependence of their insight into themselves on outward, contingent encounters leads to a provocative uncertainty about the extent to which a more autonomous form of affective introspection would be possible for them at all. It also gives rise, in the works I examine, to an appreciation of how unrelated our own quests for affective self-awareness often are to the cares and concerns of those around us. Besides James Baldwin, the authors I examine include Virginia Woolf, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Wallace Stevens, Sylvia Plath, Ralph Ellison, John Ashbery, and also the French writer Marcel Proust. These writers are not generally known for their depictions of affects as insights into our uncontrolled blind spots and inward limitations, and indeed their work is also full of moments when affective expression leads to personal empowerment and enriched mutual understanding. Many of them also highlight and criticize the hostility with which a community might actively disregard some of its members' affects and the needs that those affects indicate. I show, however, that these authors' better-known preoccupation with what E.M. Forster famously describes as an injunction to only connect frequently has an additional, more ironic undertone. These writers also capture moments when a character or speaker awkwardly tries to gather herself back into coherence in the midst of her overwhelming feelings, finding that she cannot do so without external help. These episodes do not, of course, subvert the value of entering into and contributing to affective exchanges, whether for political or for personal reasons. But they do depict characters and speakers' cognitive reliance on the people around them as vulnerably necessary because of their affects' inarticulateness and unpredictability. They also draw attention to incomplete overlaps between the different senses in which these represented beings are connected to or disconnected from, reliant on or independent of others, and to the misunderstandings that collapsing these various categories of relation or dependence can create. And here I'm also just going to give you a brief vignette of kind of formal spatial quality of this book. So every chapter of the book is organized around one or two forms of domestic spaces within which such affective encounters take place and which are used as models for this kind of intersubjective intimacy. And the authors I examine place their characters and speakers in such living rooms, bedrooms, and basements, as well as in front of mirrors, to stage instances when other people seem better able to convey the content and significance of what someone is saying than she herself can. The relative enclosure of these settings, along with the promise of intimacy they foster, highlights the limits of these characters and speakers' control over the ways in which and effects to which their affects become noticeable to others. The stable, knowable sense of one's boundaries suggested by a threshold or a bedroom is unachievable to them, even if they self-identify with these limits and enclosures very strongly. Indeed, these well-bounded spatial correlatives for the forms of self-reflection they want to nurture ultimately highlight the great difference that another person's presence makes to their sense of themselves. These enclosed spaces represent the process of naming and interpreting one's affects as one not simply of self-assertion, but of ongoing negotiations and exchanges between the self and its communities, indifferent as these communities often are to the self's affective ruminations. Now I'm going to get to Baldwin himself, and I'm going to examine Baldwin's novels in conjunction with a term from contemporary affect theory that I take from C.N. Nye, and that term is minor affects. C.N. Nye, the literary critic from University of Chicago, studies a group of affects such as paranoia, anxiety, and envy that superficially come across merely as cognitive distortions of their surroundings. She claims that these ostensibly marginal affects need to be examined in their own right, because even minor affective experiences can teach us much about ourselves and about the environments that shape us. So in my talk, I do not try to assimilate the affects Baldwin represents to Nye's particular categories, which also include cuteness, zaniness, and animatedness, and a lot of other fun stuff. However, I do engage with Nye's insistence on the specter of triviality as a frequently overlooked aspect of affective experience. And what I ask in particular is what happens when the critic figure herself, rather than just her subjects, fears that she might be moved by, and maybe even enthralled to, an affect that can only find expression and clarification in very constrained settings that actively forestall the possibility of other people's challenges or counter-perspectives. Nye treats minor affects from a detached, third-person perspective. She describes them as experiences that the texts and art objects she studies can represent and induce in their audience, but not as aspects of the condition of the person who analyzes them. Studying minor affects from such a third-person viewpoint allows her to defend them as oblique insights into their bearer's social condition. As she puts it, quoting Paolo Virno, "For all its pettiness, the feeling calls attention to a real social experience and a certain kind of historical truth." Baldwin attributes this quality of minorness to the thinker himself and to his internal affective landscape. His novels highlight the disconnect between the effort it takes to articulate one's affects and the small number of stimuli that even one's most heroic introspective endeavors can compass at any moment. They also showcase the limited, simplified contexts to which one might need to resort to explicate one's affective experience on one's own. Such simplifications make one's affects, however intense they might be, difficult to relate back to a larger social world. Baldwin struggles in his fiction to find ways of acknowledging these problems without quite letting go of the insights that forms of isolation allow his protagonists to reach. So as Henry Louis Gates Jr. describes it, Baldwin's fiction strives to represent forms of self-understanding that do not merely repeat prevalent stereotypes. His characters mine their experiences for alternative notions of who they are or who they could be. His fiction focuses on pairs of lovers rather than solitary individuals, and on love affairs that frequently break racist or homophobic social norms, and frequently both. Baldwin depicts such romantic encounters as precarious, not only because they invite other people's scorn, but also because the characters he depicts themselves have a hard time holding onto their feelings in the presence of any third person. In the society he represents, such affects are confined to being minor because of the tight, only contingently lifted restrictions imposed on their rise to awareness, even in the people involved in them, let alone in the communities in which they live. These restrictions have to do with the instantaneousness with which, once a person enters a larger social space, this space begins to shape her affective self-awareness in a way that Baldwin represents as both potentially repressive and as physically inevitable. Baldwin's commentators have sometimes accused him of political quietism and naivete. For Langston Hughes, for example, Baldwin's critical, lyrical style is intrinsically unable to capture his social conditions. As Hughes puts it, the surface excellence and poetry of his writing did not seem to me to suit the earthiness of his subject matter. Eldridge Cleaver sees this lyricism even more extremely as an expression of racial self-hatred. I argue against or in between those two positions that we can better appreciate Baldwin's aesthetic if we read his novels as narratives of discovering precisely our partial affective unself-awareness and isolation. His characters lock themselves in an incompletely self-knowing individualism because they rarely dare speak their affects' names, but also because they typically do not know all their affects' names to begin with. Baldwin devotes as much attention to depicting moments of self-discovery as to instances when, in the absence of more favorable conditions, his characters lose track of what their affects mean to them. In Giovanni's Room, which I'm going to focus on today, experiences of discovering viable spaces of affective self-recognition thus rapidly give way to experiences of losing them. In Another Country, many of Baldwin's characters can only dream of a small space in which their affects can become articulable. Even as Baldwin continues to affirm the value of the insights his characters reach in such spaces, and which sometimes become almost utopian in their apparent generality and idealism, he also insists that this generality is persistently undercut by the precarious, narrow conditions required for his expression. In these representations of affect, I argue, you can thus see clearly the narrow path that Baldwin tries to weave between completely entrusting himself to his contemporaries' self-affirming liberalism and casting wholesale doubt on the validity and potential value of individuals' personal accounts of themselves. The insights that we reach about ourselves in solitude can have profound, life-changing impact on ourselves, and maybe even on the lives of others. But to transpose these insights from their immediate secluded settings into a larger social world is, in his novels, no easy and no obvious task. So I'm just going to recap what I just said more informally before we head on to Giovanni's room itself. I guess the point I'm trying to make is that when we talk about novels, we often talk about character complexity and the complexity of character self-understanding. And we often judge novels, and we judge protagonists especially, based on the depth of insight that they seem to have into themselves, or the depth of insight that the novel itself can give us onto them, as well as by, how should I put it, the extent to which a novel is able to argue that a given character's social position and psychology captures and exemplifies a larger social condition, right? That's more or less a definition of what novels are in most standard accounts. And what I argue is that Baldwin quite deliberately refuses to give us those kinds of characters we expect of him, characters who are self-knowing and who, say, are able to boldly claim, like, because I'm gay, this is my violating American social norms, and I should be seen as an example of somebody who protests against them. Instead, he puts us in the middle space of following somebody who, first of all, isn't quite sure how he feels, and it seems like the immediate physical environments in which he is play a big role in how he believes himself to feel. So, like, basically he seems to himself to be much more gay in a gay bar than when he's back in the hotel room with his fiancée, who's a woman. He's like, oh, right, I guess I'm straight now. And he's kind of not able to hold these two identities together. And Baldwin is very interested in, kind of given that he sees himself and a lot of people around him as stuck in this midway state, when sometimes in certain isolated conditions they're able to reach what seems like a deep revolutionary insight about themselves, but then they leave the room and they're not able to hold on to this insight. So he's basically saying, like, how do you make a politics out of this? And also, how do you make a self out of this? Kind of, if you admit to yourself that this form of self-understanding is so dependent and so fleeting, and it's dependent often on the goodwill of people who don't even notice what kind of impact they're having on you, kind of, how are you supposed to kind of manage your day-to-day life? And for David in Giovanni's room, I mean, the fact that the title has room in it is very significant, because in fact small rooms become those utopian places for David, the character, in which he's able to hide and reach those insights that don't seem to remain sustainable within larger social spaces. In fact, the plot of Giovanni's room hinges on the rhythms with which characters inhabit rooms, claim them, and are confined to or thrown out of them. The narrative marks shifts in its characters' affects and personal development by recording the changes in the kinds of rooms where they meet, the length of their stay within those rooms, and the number of people who visit them there, in a way that's kind of almost comically hyper-precise. Giovanni's room begins and ends with the narrator waking up and reminiscing in a bedroom. And its two major narrative turns occur when this narrator moves first into the room of his gay lover Giovanni, and then back in with his fiancée Hella. In both cases, David's move from one room to another marks implicit choices between the affects he wants to act on and the affects that he prefers to forget. His ability to keep faith with either of these lovers is also measured by the persistence with which he returns to the room that each of them occupies. For David, as you notice very early on, rooms, and particularly bedrooms, become precious safe havens in which his affects temporarily become more intelligible and manageable. His transitions among different enclosed spaces immerse him in a series of unexpectedly illuminating, understandable feelings. But they also make him realize, as I just said, that his affects can only ever retain such clarity when he shuts himself in a small space that forestalls any other distractions. And in the metaphors that both David himself and Baldwin the narrator uses to describe David's mental states, those images of enclosure are always present. So at the beginning of the novel, when David ponders how guilty he feels because he eventually leaves Giovanni and then Giovanni dies, because it's just like every other gay novel from the 50s and 60s. So he describes his love for Giovanni at this tragic moment as a presence within his hotel room that stares back at him from every corner. And when David and Giovanni first meet at the gay bar in the scene I described at the beginning of the lecture, and then they go to Giovanni's at the end of the night, David says, "I thought if I do not open the door at once and get out of here, I'm lost. But I knew I could not open the door. I knew it was too late. Soon it was too late to do anything but moan." Near the end of the novel, David confronts his guilt towards Hella, the straight fiancée who does eventually figure out that her boyfriend is gay. So he confronts his guilt towards her in a very similar way. What happens is he sort of has a little breakdown and he decides to go to a gay bar and leaves her in the hotel room, and obviously she follows him and finds him there. And when she enters the bar, he is talking to a sailor and he sees her reflection in the mirror juxtaposed against the sailor's face. So kind of for a moment, because the mirror is here and the sailor is here, he kind of sees both the male lover and the fiancé, soon to be ex-fiancé, on the same wall. Within and in response to those spaces and moments of enclosure, David begins to name his affects with a precision and confidence that otherwise seem unattainable to him. F.W. Dupuy rightly describes the eagerness with which David, as well as Baldwin's other characters, formulate their feelings in those settings as almost comically excessive. "Nobody else in democratic America writes sentences like this anymore," he says. "It suggests the ideal prose of an ideal literary community, some aristocratic France of one's dreams." Indeed, David describes the layers of his affective experience with an almost painful generality and earnestness. So he says, for example, about his early relationship to Giovanni, "Beneath the joy, of course, was anguish, and beneath the amazement was fear. But they did not work themselves to the beginning until our high beginning was aloe on our tongues. By then, anguish and fear had become the surface on which we slipped and slid, losing balance, dignity, and pride." So David previously acted on this feeling obliquely and vaguely. He befriended an older gay man, he expressed tolerance towards homosexuals, he agreed for his fiancée to kind of go off to Spain for a long holiday without him. And suddenly, kind of within this small confinement, he is able to name those feelings and their cumulative effect with a precision that is such that it seems as if those feelings had become a quality of the physical surroundings themselves. Indeed, he physicalizes those affects to the point that he begins to describe them as the very foundation on which he stands. Kathleen Drown, who's another critic, claims that such immersive experiences lead David and Baldwin's other characters to recognize that they will carry their affective lives with them wherever they go and act on them in any environments that allow them to do so. And indeed, these florid generalizations do convey an initial hope that such affects could be transposed beyond the small spaces where they first find expression. David thus reaffirms his love for Giovanni by noting that it actually leads him to find other men attractive. At that very moment, they're walking down the street, there passed between us on the pavement another boy, a stranger, and I invested him at once with Giovanni's beauty, and what I felt for Giovanni I also felt for him. Giovanni saw this, and saw my face, and it made him laugh the more. When David and Giovanni live together, which they do for a while, David also believes that Giovanni wants him to express his affection by destroying and thus opening up their shared space. And David says, I understood why Giovanni had wanted me and had brought me to his last retreat. I was to destroy this room and to give to Giovanni a new and better life. In all these passages, the rooms David inhabits seem like temporary stages in the expression of an affect that ideally would be much more flexible and expansive. The clarity with which his characters experience these affects in such enclosures inspires them to believe that those affects might be potentially expressible and intelligible anywhere. So you see, what I'm saying is that there's an initial optimistic or utopian movement in the novel, which is also true of most of his other novels, where it seems like, okay, I needed this small room to have a revelation to begin with, but maybe now that I have this idea in my head, I can walk out of the room and begin to act on it in more shared public spaces. So that there's a hope for something that seems like Freudian or even Hegelian, kind of self-overcoming. So like, okay, I have the concept and this is enough for me to be able to have this feeling become operative in the world in which I live. But the rest of the novel records what is essentially the breakdown of this hope. And it also tries to explain to you, through similar phenomenological means, exactly why this hope inevitably has to fail. So even as such small spaces make characters' affects seem temporarily transparent and indeed earth-shattering, Baldwin also highlights David's difficulty in not only finding such small spaces in the first place, but also in holding on to them. He also highlights the gap between finding for one's affect such a temporary, highly personal set of correlatives and being able to make these affects articulable in social life, or even to predict the way in which their presence might change your ties to other people. Characters' affects remain minor, both because of the smallness and rarity of the spaces where they find satisfying expression, and also because of how inarticulate and out of place they soon come to seem within any other environment. So that, again, with almost comic or tragicomic inevitability, as soon as David leaves any particular room where a revelation takes place, his affections instantly become ambiguous and scattered. To put it in C.N. terms, the critic I began with, these represented affects are plagued by a non-cathartic quality that makes the insights to which they give rise perpetually suspect and ephemeral. And their ephemerality stems in great part from the extreme paucity of the communities and contexts in which they can be safely and clearly recognized. So that occasional experiences of small enveloping spaces show Baldwin's characters that their affects inevitably lose their coherence without such forms of closed outward containment. And the discoveries they make about themselves in private, whenever they enter a public sphere, rapidly and easily give way to much more conventional, socially acceptable choices. Baldwin models the fragility of David's affective self-understanding through images of dirt, dust, and litter. On a day-to-day level, David and Giovanni often show their affection, while it lasts, by letting a layer of dirt and dust and flaked paint cover all of their belongings as a sign that they're still working on the bedroom together. They also make explicit their anger, fear, and joy at each other's presence by staining their room and littering both inside and outside it. They break glasses, they throw cherry pits into the street, they spill wine onto the floor, they tear up banknotes. At first, those acts of littering take place within the confines of the bedroom they inhabit together, which marks their affect's continued presence and accumulation in this small space. It's as if the affects, like the waste, were accumulating in the room, eventually to fill it and to kind of take up this shape as a form of solidity. But even within the room, they only create relatively shapeless piles of debris, which are only given a shape by the room itself. And the fragmentariness of this residue becomes even more precarious and obvious when Giovanni and David begin to fight with each other and take their quarrels out into the street. Once they drift away from their shared bedroom, their affective expression and awareness lose consistency. David and Giovanni find that they can neither entirely eliminate their affects from their lives, nor take full stock of them moment by moment. There remains of these affects only a sense, as one of Giovanni's friends put it, said accusingly of David, of being dirty. Giovanni ultimately expresses his despair at losing David by literally and metaphorically getting blood on his hands. He ends up killing somebody. And he thus enacts the kind of violence that Giovanni and David often feared from their surrounding communities. Meanwhile, as he waits to hear the news of Giovanni's execution, after Giovanni killed a man who tried to hit on him, David tries to assuage his guilt by obsessively cleaning his new bedroom, which, it is worth adding, he does not share with anybody. So kind of after those images of David and Giovanni collecting dirt in a shared bedroom, we have this image of David trying to get rid of his feelings and feel in control of them by literally cleaning his hotel room over and over again. So of course, you might say here that you should read those stains and spills that David scrubs off the tub and of the floor, etc., as self-hating Freudian transpositions of ejaculation. And indeed, some of the ways in which Baldwin's characters dirty or stain their environment obviously involve gay sex. And Drown, another critic, interprets those images of sullied rooms as follows: the internal struggle within both characters between the homophobe and the homosexual, the orderly and the disorderly, becomes overtly visible in the dirt and clutter that overwhelm the physical spaces they occupy. But I would argue that Baldwin is equally concerned with highlighting David's difficulty in articulating and holding on to the felt significance of such an intimate act. These images of dirt signify not only social stigma, but also, just as insistently, the incoherent structure of the forms of awareness that he reaches, and the ease with which those forms of awareness can be discarded, disregarded, and cleaned off, as it were. And I'm going to jump over a reading here, because you don't want to hear about this. But, so to think about the politics of this representation of affect, not just within a gay context, but in the general context of Baldwin's fiction, I often like to compare scenes like that to a fragment from Notes of a Native Son, where Baldwin describes seeing an exhibit at the Louvre. And he says, "I was forced to recognize that I was a kind of bastard of the West. These were not really my creations." He's looking at white Westerners' paintings at the Louvre. "They do not contain my history. I might search in them in vain forever for any reflection of myself. I was an interloper. This was not my heritage. At the same time, I had no other heritage which I could possibly hope to use. I had certainly been unfitted for the jungle or the tribe." The plight Baldwin describes here does not obviously fully match the plight of David and Giovanni, but the disconnectedness that they experience involve a similar discovery, namely that your communities don't seem to make an effort to help you take stock of the experiences you have within them, or to make those experiences feel continuous and articulable. Cleaver accuses Baldwin of racial self-hatred in relation to passages just such as this one. For other people, such as Porter and Feldman, these moments exemplify Baldwin's productive double vision, so that some people read images such as these to say that Baldwin creates parallaxes, essentially, between his experience as a Black American and the experiences of white Westerners in general. And again, I want to slightly disagree with both of those options. On the one hand, granted, this quotation and Baldwin's representations of his characters do highlight how histories of social oppression and sexism and racism in other cases disrupt and damage the lives of Baldwin's contemporaries. However, Baldwin makes this point in a paradoxical way. He does it not by trusting his own affects or those of his characters, but by suggesting that both the author and the characters struggle with these affects in environments that don't offer stable foundations or reflections for them. This attitude hinges on continually contesting the notion of affective introspection as something you can undertake easily and spontaneously. Instead, Baldwin represents such inward self-scrutiny as a process that you can accomplish and whose conclusions you can hold on to only within a precariously favorable context that shields from distractions and especially from the potentially judgmental presence of hostile and uncomprehending others. And I guess what I try to say in analyses such as these is that part of what Baldwin constructs for us is the image of kind of the ideal introspective thinker as somebody who is buttressed by intense privilege and social convention. So that we might often think that, say, within our feelings we find resistance to social conventions, so that kind of we might discover in ourselves something that forces us to break them. And Baldwin shows, sure, that's true, but it also requires a concurrent alternative form of convention investment to be able to articulate what that resistance consists in the first place. So in that sense, he kind of fragments and displaces what might seem to be a binary opposition or dialectic between the individual and society into a much more kind of networked, environmental, kind of archipelago-like structure in which different small forms of awareness are maybe more possible than we think, but the problem is they are much more difficult to act on and gather together than a Marxist form of critique might make you assume. And through readings such as these in general, I kind of try to make the point that, so we might think of ourselves, if we are, as I am, interested in studying affects, it might seem like there's a critical danger to it, because like, oh, if I don't know how I'm feeling in the moment, clearly I must be continually in error in my analysis of feelings, because I'm always delayed in my understanding, even of my own feelings, let alone the feelings of other people. But I want to say, kind of, it's in this moment of delay and the openness onto the public sphere and communal sphere that it necessarily creates that we can find some of the most interesting means by which affects connect our internal knowledge into forms of social knowledge and kind of force us to think about political experiences of dialogue and negotiation in more sophisticated ways. Thank you. Yes?
Thank you, Marta. I heard you speak this year and the year before, but yeah. So my expectations were high for a Harvard graduate and a Yale tenure track professor. I'm very satisfied.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will have. So I want to begin because I have this sweeping question.
Yes, please.
General. So you because of that, it refers to the first part of your talk.
Yes.
So could you tell us more about how you see the relationship between modernism and sort of modernist literary theory and then postmodernism and affect theory?
Yes, I would love to. Thank you. So I guess I want to begin by saying I focus on modernism as the subject of this book, but I don't want to suggest it's the only locus where you might find instances of characters like that. I do think, however, that modernism is one moment in the history of Western literature when those kinds of affective negotiations become very present and very consciously represented. And to me, this has to do with kind of a few factors. I mean, first of all, is the whole modernist kind of discovery of the unconscious, discovery of psychoanalysis, but also the fact that those ideologies are not yet integrated and taken for granted. So kind of even 20 or 30 or 50 years later, kind of even if in our contemporary understanding of affect, we take a lot of things for granted. Like we take for granted that even if psychoanalysis isn't right, something like psychoanalysis would be productive if only it worked. We take for granted very often that, as people put it, the personal is the political. So kind of if we're having a feeling, it necessarily ties back in critical Marxist fashion to some broader social condition. And part of what I'm trying to do is to disrupt some of those assumptions and say, even though there are many contexts when they hold true, there are also many interesting contexts when they don't hold true. And in those exceptions, we might find means of basically thinking more critically and self-critically about the relationship between the critical subject undertaking a work of psychoanalysis or of critique and the object of this analysis. And we might think more self-consciously about the power dynamic involved in that kind of setup. So in that sense, I kind of take modernism as my subject because those questions still feel very open to a lot of those writers. And in fact, because they're very afraid of what will happen to their art if those questions are so open. Like for Baldwin, in a way that becomes even more obvious if you look at more of his novels, there's a deep anxiety about what this notion of affect does to the novel. And I argue that a lot of kind of the reasons why late Baldwin is so under-theorized and kind of critically underappreciated is precisely because his characters begin to unravel more and more under the pressure of this view of affect as obscure and inarticulate. I would say postmodernism and also our current critical moment have generally ridden the wave of a confidence in affect, which increased especially post-deconstruction. There's a very good book by Ray Tarada which shows that you could read deconstruction as in some way a return to feeling as an aspect of cognition, because it's all about cognitive delays. So people kind of read the beginning of affect, the affective turn into Derrida. And what I'm kind of trying to say is I go back to that and say there are roads not taken here and questions not answered that we need to bring back into contemporary discourse. I hope that begins to answer the question.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, yes. Yes, thank you.
I have a similar, actually.
Yes.
I would ask a similar question about modernism and queer studies.
Yeah.
And I would think that modernism is similarly useful for queer studies.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, exactly. And Heather Love is a really good book about this called Feeling Backward, where she talks about, so if you haven't read Heather Love's book, it's very good. It's basically about books such as Giovanni's Room, where you have incompletely self-aware, to us seemingly queer characters whose lives generally end badly. And the question is, how do we talk about that literature without either just accusing it of incomplete self-awareness, because clearly those people are very self-aware, they're writing about it, but also without attributing to them a kind of false, retroactively projected optimism of like, oh, if only they knew that they could love themselves, it could all be good. It's kind of, what can we learn from a position of partial self-hatred? That's basically the theme of what I do. Yes?
Thank you so very much for talking, bringing Baldwin to us today. This is October, and Baldwin is absolutely one of the most inspirational to me writers. Really.
Yeah.
And I have a couple of questions. Maybe,
Yes.
I want to be monopolizing this time. One of the very, very simple question, basic question. It's about epiphany, modernism, and Baldwin.
Yeah.
You seem to really redefine, not define is a bad word here, but it's like rethink that moment of self-discovery, self-awareness, and bring it down from that moment of metaphysical epiphany, which this is how usually modernism has been kind of,
Right.
you are playing with those moments. So that's my first question. The second question is about confinements.
Yeah.
Those places of confinement. One beautiful analysis that you did here. I'm absolutely fascinated by what you did with Giovanni's work. But there is also a question about the other types of spaces. How would you, Baldwin does seem
Yes.
to have that
Yeah.
kind of propensity for places.
Yes.
And for those, elaborating, describing that. And I'm thinking, for example, in Sunny's Blues, there is one of the very powerful scenes. I don't remember if you remember this scene when he's sitting on the subway in New York City,
Yeah.
and this is that. And it's a hostile place.
Yeah.
It's a place of confinement. I remember, for example, there is a short story that I actually worked on this evening, so soon, when he's in Paris, and by the end, and it's, the trajectory is exactly the same one as you developed here, from that utopia to the much more problematic, way of thinking about the awareness and and politics. So they are getting onto the elevator, and that's described as a cage. It's also one of his favorite. But that's that image is a very powerful image in Baldwin. In a couple of places, people getting on the elevator,
absolutely.
Together. So my question is, how would you address this to this other, that
Yes, thank you so much for that question. I'm going to begin with the second question and work my way back to the first one, because it actually, in the larger chapter version of this talk, I actually do talk about those spaces a lot. It seems to me that Baldwin is interested both in characters who are able to find something like David and Giovanni's bedroom, but also in characters who cannot do so, and who keep having partial and incomplete epiphanies or kind of misguided epiphanies in spaces where, as you say, it's too hostile, it's too loud, or sometimes like in another country, the wrong person has the epiphany. There's an amazing moment where one of the characters sees two of the other characters dancing, and she realizes they're in love with each other, which they don't know yet, but there is never a moment when anybody communicates that to anybody else. And then that love affair soon kind of deconstructs out of this lack of awareness. There's also, especially in another country, this beautiful, kind of terrible, beautiful sequence in which Rufus, the main character, dies, and he keeps saying, "Now I've hit bottom," and then he keeps on going. It's as if he kept looking for a wall that he could hit, but then he cannot find the wall. And then he eventually dies by drowning. So his body literally cannot find the bottom because it's like floating in the river. And here Baldwin seems to not only make a point about the way those small confined spaces and private spaces allow you to reach some introspective insight, but also to make strong, try to explore, like, okay, so what kind of insight can you have in a crowded room? Or what are you supposed to do if you are not accorded this introspective depth, now that you know it to be so situationally contingent? So yeah, I would say that's a whole subgenre within Baldwin, especially late Baldwin, which often, so in late Baldwin novels, the narrative often takes place from within somebody's bedroom, like a character's about to die or is very sick and he's just reminiscing. But then that bedroom is the only private space you see. So it's the moment from which you can think back onto your life, but when you also realize how you've never actually had this kind of space for this kind of narrative to even occur to you. Yeah, and about epiphany, I think that's definitely, in early Baldwin especially, I mean, the religious aspect of the epiphanies is huge, but and people talk about those early novels as having the secular and the physical invade religious epiphany and reshape it. But I would say the same of James Joyce, in fact. Kind of a lot of those epiphanies are much more ironic than early critics give them credit for. In part because like after the epiphany is over, there's still like many hours to the day you have to go on and like nothing changes. And the question of the status of this isolated moment within a larger sphere of what you realize to be other phenomenological states whose phenomenology you are now also interested in and you want to validate, kind of all of that also shifts the balance of what it means to have a revelation in the first place, and kind of how it relates to, say, moments when you're asleep or moments when you're just distracted. Yes.
If we are talking about rooms and spaces, I'm also obsessed with spaces and rooms in literature.
Yeah.
So last year I asked you about rented spaces.
Yeah,
So
I remember, yeah.
This year I have a different question. It came to my mind when we were answering Eva's question. When I was in high school, as probably most of us, I read this novel by Wierzchowska, I think, Wspólny Pokój.
Oh, I haven't read that.
Okay. If I remember correctly, it's a Polish modernist novel, like a really good one, about these bohemians and artists who share a room.
Got it.
There are many people in the room, and we have to share it, and it ends tragically.
Yeah.
No one writes anything. And it reminded me of Wallace Thurman's modernist novel, Infants of the Spring,
Right, of
where
course,
they
yeah.
share a room and it ends badly.
Yeah.
The novel is not written.
Yeah.
Thurman steals the novel from the guy who. So we have this shared room, and on the other hand, we have another modernist text, Virginia Woolf's A Room of
One's Own, yes.
So and there is also this right. It's not one's own only, but it's this room as a creative space
Yes.
as well, right?
Yeah.
So it's about being an artist, a female artist, or so every artist, it seems, needs a room of their own in modernism. So is it something, again, that has to do you think, with modernism?
I think so. I think it also
Today?
has to do in that period just with people writing who were not previously allowed to write. I mean, a white man in the 19th century would not have had to think about a room of his own because he had a room of his own. And I think Baldwin and Woolf, as well as some of the other people I write about, kind of see this as kind of almost a sociological self-discovery. It's like, oh, in order to maintain a certain form of attention, you need to have a certain form of privacy. And it seems like the two are sort of codependent. But other kinds of rooms are also, so I have a chapter in that book on Woolf where I talk about her use of living rooms as moments, as spaces where you kind of herd people into them expecting them to understand each other, but then they don't, obviously, as in Woolf. Or like they think they understand each other, but they don't, or they come out of interactions believing opposite things. And I see that in that particular context as Woolf's exploration of kind of the failure of that particularly feminized social space to do the thing it was supposed to do, namely to make people socialize and create communities. So I would say like the kinds of rooms explored and the kinds of spaces explored are also much broader. But in terms of the small confined space in particular, yeah, I would say it just has to do with people kind of trying to figure out what kind of investment you actually need to get to do what the establishment is already getting to do. Justyna?
Yeah. I'm thinking about my philosophy students and have this question. Could you say something about the relationship between the unconscious and affects?
Yes.
You've been mentioning psychoanalysis and...
Oh, absolutely.
I think that...
Okay, so the standard definition of affect is that it's a part of ourselves of which we can become conscious, but which is not always or necessarily made conscious to us. So this is a way in which, so the Freudian unconscious, to back up, for Freud there is a part of our psyche that we basically never become aware of, even if somebody explicitly talks to us about it. And if it's always submerged, we can always hypothesize about it. Affect theory, and I agree with this, is less strict about this division, but it continues to be strict about this notion of delay and the possibility of something not being unearthed. So say I might have had a feeling this morning that I didn't notice, and there it was, it's gone. Like nobody's going to make me aware of it. But that doesn't mean that it could not have potentially kind of been brought into awareness and into a social construction. And to me, part of what's interesting about that definition is that in early affect theorists, this bred an obsession with self-discovery. It's like, oh my God, we need to like really study our affects because they're going to go away. and like somebody's got to unearth them, somebody's going to mine us for them because they might be insightful. And what I'm trying to say is like, no, maybe they're not. Or kind of what are we to do with the fact that a lot of them are actually not that interesting, especially not to other people. That we are still compelled in order to function as bodies and minds in society to try to make sense of them because they are part of what we have to navigate and control in getting through the world to begin with. So to me, there's a kind of interesting tension between affective self-awareness as a pragmatic need for the individual body, which is more tied to kind of individual therapy, and a desire to kind of claim philosophical importance to this act of bringing something from the unconscious into the conscious, which to me is not impossible, but is at best inconsistent and kind of not predictable to the extent that we might think it to be.
I have a question.
Yes.
What do you think about the way of affect theory being enriching maybe theories of humor?
Humor?
Humor.
Yeah.
Yes, because that when we adopt that kind of Freudian approach to humor,
Yeah.
that there's so much more to humor than just simple congruity, which is a kind
Yeah.
of a cognitive process and the process of deriving satisfaction, intellectual, aesthetic-like satisfaction
Yeah.
from following incongruity. But how about if we adopt the Freudian approach and that there is
No, I think that's very true, but I also see that kind of as both a potential and a potential danger. There's a way in which, if part of what I appreciate about Freud is that he allows jokes to remain funny in his retelling of them. Like it doesn't always have to be about the father. Like sometimes it's about something much more trivial. And I think affect theory has the potential to do that. It also has the potential to be so self-serious as to kill every joke and turn every joke into some commentary about capitalism, which it might always be to some extent, but sometimes that explanation is more productive than at other times. And I guess I'm interested in that spectrum of explanations and the distance from some instances of unconscious behavior to that political explanation versus others. But yeah, definitely. And there's in fact, I think there was a special issue of Critical Inquiry a year ago. That's the comedy issue, which was co-edited by Lauren Berland and Sia Nye. I think it has a banana and Bert and Ernie on it. But I recommend it. Yes?
I don't want to monopolize the floor.
No, but I don't see any hands behind you.
So I have one more question. Right, so because we are, as you have heard in my previous questions, we are all trying to figure out what comes after postmodernism.
Yeah.
So we refer to it as the current critical moment and
Right.
and I listened to your great talk yesterday about which analyzed works from the last 2 decades. So how do you see both the difference between the two projects, right, and the primary sources that you're working with? And yes, and the follow-up to my previous question: do we need a woman today, or when we have Facebook, we perhaps do not any longer need anyone?
That's a really good question. So I would say all of my projects, like part of why I decided to write about the contemporary is because I realized that in writing about modernism, and also my first book goes back all the way to the early 17th century, I realized I was essentially writing about a very contemporary perspective that I was trying to articulate, which is a perspective of suspicion about introspection as a mode of self-knowledge, and especially of shareable self-knowledge that goes beyond kind of therapeutic value. I basically realized that I no longer buy the argument that like if I only sit in a room and write about my life, like something interesting is going to come out of it. Where like Virginia Woolf does have this belief still that like if only you give women rooms and notebooks and pencils, kind of good things are going to happen. And to me, part of the discovery of Facebook and social media is that now you get to look at all that stuff and you're like, oh, not necessarily. Like some of this I really haven't been written. Like some of it I wish I hadn't spent half of my night looking at for like no good reason. So to me there's a kind of ideal which is still present in modernism where, because it seems like your internal affective life still appears to be so ineffable, and if only you found ways to express it more fully and better, and photographs and phonographs are two ways in which this fullness is idealized, and if you could attain to a kind of knowledge, any amount of which, or any increase in which would be an increase in positive value. Mm-hmm. And I would say right now we're kind of getting, and I would say David Foster Wallace and the New Sincerity people, we're still riding that wave. But something tipped over in the last 10 or 15 years where we're beginning to wonder or look more critically upon this notion of the value of the personal to larger social discourse as something that is unquestioned or a kind of resistance we need to overcome. And to me that would be, I would say, a difference in mode or a difference in emphasis, but a continuity in the kind of mode of approach and interest. Thank you. Yes.
One more, which is actually also inspired partly by what Eva was asking. I'm kind of mulling this in my mind. What you talked about this, kind of no doubt with the fact that in Baldwin there's no direct relation between the inside and outside,
right,
personal and political. And in some ways that the fact that the introspective thinker is always grounded in privilege.
Right.
So I'm thinking about the difficulty of using this when you're reading writers, other early gay and lesbian writers.
Of course, yes.
Audre Lorde, and it's obviously. So.
Yes, of course. And I would say it's not so much, I'm not trying to say there's no value or privilege, or like that privilege is not important. What I'm trying to say is, in a weird way, in contemporary expression, precisely because that kind of privilege is much easier to obtain, it's like the incremental value of any additional item of introspection has lessened. So it feels almost like an economic analysis. Kind of if the internet were swept away and we once again only had 5 gay and lesbian memoirs, we would cling on to them. But now that we have autostraddle, it's just like whatever. Like I can always refresh. And to me that's an interesting paradox because, and there is obviously continued political importance to having certain voices heard, but as we were talking about yesterday over dinner, like it often seems like in contemporary culture, even a hashtag, like the Me Too campaign, kind of even just asserting the addition of your voice to a chorus seems to be enough to have that political impact. And there kind of used to be kind of 2 parallel tracks of asserting the value of self-expression, one of which was political. And that political one, I would say, has remained relatively unscathed. But the other one was philosophical in a sense, or kind of even if you are an overprivileged white man, if you really, really try, you can still do it. And I would say Nausgaard is the last swan song of that. And he is trying really, really hard. But yeah, I would say like definitely, especially when you go back to historical documents. And if this also like ceases to be true because of the paucity of those documents.
Yeah. I was thinking, actually, this was not critical at all.
No, I know. I just wanted to piggyback. Yeah.
Sudden illumination.
Oh.
When we started talking about humor, and I thought that there is a way of actually thinking about both of those together. I mean, an example such as Baldwin and such as Lorde.
Right.
And I have talked about Lorde at some point. The lesbian terms, the lesbian has this opposition between irony and humor.
Yeah.
And of course Baldwin is the ironic one.
Yeah.
And Lorde is a kind of an excessive over-identification with too many possible figures, lesbian mother, etc.
Yes,
etc. Whereas Baldwin never has kind of one that's successful. So you could be thinking about those both belonging to not so distant a philosophical tradition, but simply taking these 2 there are these two options,
Right.
two ways in which you can attempt to address self-identification.
No, I think that's absolutely true. And I think you could read Baldwin's fascination with dirt as the kind of Deleuzian remnant, where in Audley Lorde the multiplicity is allowed to exist fully. And in Baldwin it's always sort of half repressed, kind of present but discarded. Yeah, no, I think I totally agree with that. Thank you. Okay.
There are questions from the students.
Yes, guys.
Does anybody have a question, a comment, anything you would like to say? Ask or add? Anything.
I think we've already,
I know, it's been, I know, it's been, I know, we've killed it. But maybe, maybe there is somebody who's, like, has something in their head. Please, don't be quiet. This is the...
All right, let's not torture them.
No, but
Right, I think we really so if you still are thinking about the questions, we'll have still a minute or two. So I hope that Marta has very successfully encouraged you to read Baldwin.
Read
Right,
Baldwin.
so my first year student, Baldwin is such a great read. I don't know why it's disappeared from the syllabus together with the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. So really Baldwin is, he's a great guy. So I was really glad that some of my first year students would listen to Marta, and in this way we could make up for the terrible change. And right, so any questions? So if not, let's thank Marta, and I would like to take a picture of you because, as you probably have heard, we are initiating a lecture series in American Studies, and Marta is our great first speaker. We'll not get a better one. Harvard graduate, Yale tenure track professor. So we can't beat that, but as an opener, it's wonderful. So next semester we'll have people talking about 19th century lesbians, pet memoirs, and Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, among others. So it's going to be fun. Right, so let's thank Marta. Take a concert-like picture. Thank you all.